And then, most of all, you realize, and you can finally realize, that the trauma is no longer actually happening. You were just reliving the trauma because you had yet to let it go. Because you had yet to know how to let it go, and that's all good. So typically a fight or flight response comes from a trauma-induced trigger point, okay? Meaning, when we're in fear, it's that fight or flight response. But it's that very basic level of consciousness. Fear, fear, fear. And of course, fear is a basic level of consciousness. And if we're living life in a fight or flight fashion, or if something happens and it triggers that fight or flight response, it's 99.9% of the time, if not 100% of the time, always because something happened that subconsciously reminded you of a trauma that happened in your past. And when that happens, your brain reacts the same, which creates the same emotional feeling, which therefore creates the same reaction within you and the same perception. But the trauma is the unconscious trigger. And that's all its job is there. The trauma is there to create an unconscious trigger in you. And the purpose of that is to bring your attention to it. Because believe it or not, the trauma you chose knows it's intended to be healed, and it knows its job is to show you your unhealed parts. Yet another reason to not react and try and fight it. So don't try and shut it up. Don't try and run from it. Because it ain't going to make it go away any damn way. If anything, it's just going to get louder, which is its job. As you try and run from it, its job is to scream at you that it's still there and that you'll never be able to avoid healing it. But accept the fucky. Accept that the trauma is there. Because it's the trauma that creates the drama. But this is the importance to identifying the trauma and peeling back the layers within those traumatic experiences. Healing it bit by bit. Because every time your trauma, your unhealed parts come up and you peel back another layer through the understanding, a higher perspective, a higher consciousness, ultimately the knowing of your soul. Every time you peel that back a little bit more, then the more, number one, you realize the trauma wasn't your fucking fault in the first place. And when you realize it wasn't your fault, then you also start to understand, and this is where the big shifts start to happen, as you probably all well know. You start to understand why your soul chose all the traumas in the first place, because again, you brought all of this shit on yourself, my friends. The infinitely intelligent part of you that cannot fuck up chose it all. And then so you start realizing the purpose behind the trauma and what you were intended to learn from the trauma. And then, most of all, you realize, and you can finally realize, that the trauma is no longer actually happening. You were just reliving the trauma because you had yet to let it go. Because you had yet to know how to let it go, and that's all good. But eventually you did. And then you do the peeling back. And you realize what it was all for. And then you realize you're free. And once you realize you're free, once you identify the core of your trauma and you heal that, there's no way in hell you can live in fight or flight in regards to that trigger ever again. In fact, the trigger will eventually cease to exist, because once you find the core of your problems and you heal it, any extension of that problem, any side effect, any symptoms, any extensions of that core trauma, once you get rid of the core, all of its arms disappear. It has to, because its life force is gone. The motherboard is gone. The reason, the core, the trauma is gone. So all belief systems, all behaviors, all feelings that were attached to this core trauma cease to exist with it. But you'll never find out the trauma if you just react from ego. If you just react from fear. If you just fight everything that you think is bad that's happening to you. Because none of it is truly bad. There's no such truly there's no such thing as good or bad in this world, only necessity for growth. And sometimes we need some bad shit in order to instigate growth. But your soul's laughing through it all because your soul knows it's all goddamn not only perfect, but literally everything you need to become who you're here to become, to do what you're here to do so that you can experience life in your full power, your full authenticity. Essentially, so that you can live life in the physical as you are in spirit. In other words, so you can have continuous soulgasms. That's what you chose it all for. Heal the trauma, you'll heal the drama. It's really that simple. Not that easy, but it really is that simple.